Welcome to the Ohio Department of Transportation Early Acquisition and Advanced Acquisition module. Purpose of this course will be the online version for Acquisition 103 under Early Acquisition. The module will cover the basic principles of early and advanced acquisition of the project and how to use the appropriate forms when handling these acquisitions. At the end of this module, you will be given a knowledge check to make sure that you understand the process of early and advanced acquisition. We're going to be taking a look at a couple of things, such as definitions of early and advanced acquisition, how preliminary engineering is used when real estate acquisition, the process of early acquisition flow charts, the acquisition of known as the NIAGFO, known as the Notice of Intent to Acquire and Good Faith Offer, and the process for the advanced acquisition. In early acquisition, this follow under 23 CFR 710.105. And that definition explains as acquisition of real property interests by acquiring agency prior to completion of the environmental review process for proposed transportation project. We look at the acronym known as NEPA. And what does that mean? And that's the National Environmental Protection Act. Basically, the NEPA requires agencies to assess the environmental effects of their proposed actions prior to a decision. We're going to take a look at the range of those actions that consist of making decisions on permit applications, adopting federal land management action, and constructing highways and other public-owned facilities. When we're looking at the acquisition prior to the final NEPA decision, there are two types of acquisitions prior to the NEPA decision. We're going to be looking at the early acquisition, which early acquisition consists of early acquisition of under preliminary engineering, the state funded early acquisition, federal funded early acquisition. And then we're going to take a look at advanced acquisition. Under advanced acquisition, we have hardship acquisition, protective buy acquisition. Now, district offices have their responsibilities with regards to the early acquisition under preliminary engineering. And the district office shall complete a C1 form to clear the NEPA action for the real estate to be acquired before obtaining federal authorization. The district office must obtain federal authorization before it performs any acquisition activity under preliminary engineering. The district will use and complete the federal authorization request form, and on that federal authorization request form, they'll identify a box in that form, and that's where they'll check PE environmental, preliminary engineering environmental. Then the federal authorization form is sent to ODOT, Office of Federal Accounting. This office will enter information from the form into the FEMA system, which is known as the Fiscal Management Information System. FHWA reviews the information in the FEMA system. Once FHWA concurs, an official from FHWA enters a signature into the FEMA system. This signature authorizes the acquisition activity under preliminary engineering. And finally, the Office of Accounting sends the district office a copy of the signed FHWA authorization by email with a PDF attachment. Once authorized, the district may complete the following limited acquisition activities. And basically, it gets directly into title search, preliminary property map preparation, appraisal review, and or waiver valuation, and the establishment of the FMVE. It's very important to notice that under no condition may the district initiate negotiations with the property owner during the preliminary engineering phase of the project. Negotiations with the owner must wait until the environmental document review process with the NEPA is complete. And you'll find this under our real estate manual section referenced as 5301.04. Under the environmental document for the project corridor is not completed yet. So since it's not completed yet, then you have to utilize the C1 environmental review form is used to clear the NEPA action for the real estate being acquired for early acquisition of the project. It occurs prior to the federal authorization, provides a NEPA clearance for acquisition parcels only. So what you're going to be doing is preparing that C1 for those parcels that are going to be affected with the acquisition for that project. Any impacts will be covered by the NEPA document for the project as a whole. This document that you're looking at is the C1 form for early acquisition of right-of-way. This is where all the pertinent information would be placed on this form and is signed by the District Environmental Coordinator. The request for federal authorization. When looking at the request for federal authorization, a couple of areas have to be identified. You're identifying it first as early acquisition, right-of-way acquisition, and then you're selecting the PE environmental box. So that way you'll be able to know that it is consistent with what you are requiring under preliminary engineering. Once the funded early acquisition project is authorized, it will have its own federal agreement number known as the FAN. All invoices authorized under this agreement must be billed under this FAN. Request the FHWA to allow for early acquisition. The following letter is sent to FHWA prior to federal authorization. Request for federal approval for early acquisition letter. This form is located on the Office of Real Estate website. The environmental document for the real estate to be acquired is completed, which is the C1 form. The right-of-way plans also are going to be included. And then it's very important to know that FHWA will compare it to the requirements out of 23 CFR. If the FHWA concurs that the information complies with the requirements in 23 CFR, it will allow ODOT to request federal authorization for the early acquisition. So it's very important to make sure that everything is in place because that information that you will provide will be compared with FHWA, matching it with 23 CFR. Here is the federal authorization letter that will be submitted to FHWA requesting that authorization. Now, here is the chart for early acquisition under preliminary engineering. The first area that you notice is more to your left, where it talks about obtain federal authorization, check PE, environmental on the federal authorization request form. You will notice that there are 4 blocks on that chart. You have titles, appraisals, review, and you have the FMVE. That is all that you can do under preliminary acquisition. Once the environmental is complete and it is finished, then you'll move towards the next authorization, negotiations, obtaining a right of entry, performing relocation, and you'll be able to go ahead to appropriate if necessary. And you'll be able to issue a certification of right-of-way control letter. So that gives you the full authorization. Next, we're going to take a look at the federal project state funds in early acquisition. This is under 710.501 early acquisition. A state agency may initiate acquisition of real property interest for a proposed transportation project at any time, as long as it has legal authority to do so. The state agency may undertake early acquisition projects before the completion of the environmental review process of a transportation project. State agencies may fund the early acquisition project cost entirely with the state funds with no federal credit or reimbursement. Once the district office may complete the following but limited acquisition activities. Of course, we have the title search. Title search has to be with every single parcel. You have to have an appraisal and waiver evaluation, appraisal review, establish FMVE, initiate negotiations, continue negotiations, and possibility there is a right of entry. Relocation has to be offered. Closing, that means that we have now reached an agreement and we're going to close on that parcel. It's important documentation needs to be very clear prior to appropriation and project certification. So we got to make sure that we have to have environmental document cleared before we can move forward with appropriating a parcel or a project being certified. Here is the chart for federal projects with state funds in early acquisition. So, kind of like what we just talked about of the listed items, now we have it in a chart form. We have the titles, appraisal review. We also have the FMVE, the initiations of negotiations. We have continued negotiations or relocation, right of entry, or a closing. We got to make sure that the funds are encumbered prior to initiating a title report, as well as we have to make sure funds are encumbered to pay the consultant. In the event that we have to appropriate a parcel, then we have to wait until the environmental document is cleared, as well as when we have to issue the certification of right-of-way control letter. Now, here's a chart for early acquisition under federal and standard acquisition, federal funded. A little bit larger chart. When you take a look at it, your first one is the first authorization. This is where we had talked about under preliminary engineering, where you have titles, appraisal review, and FMVE. Notice that, once again, the FHWA will reimburse for preliminary acquisition activities on a project that is not NEPA cleared. Its limitations is that there is no initiation of negotiations until the NEPA document has been approved. You will have, of course, the FAN, which is the federal agreement number. It will be identified the same on all of the project. We take a look at authorization number 2. Authorization number 2 allows you to go ahead and start initiating the early acquisition offer, as well as you be able to handle closings, disbursement of funds, and transfer to ODOT voluntarily acquisitions, as well as perform the right of entry. There's all the conditions that are listed right below, which pertains to the authorization number 2. Authorization number 3. This is where we're getting into the federal funding here, where we're able to have the full authority to initiate and use the standard NIAGFO. We no longer have to use the early acquisition NIAGFO because we now have full authorization that will allow us to go ahead and move forward with the distribution of closing funds, title being transferred to successful acquisition, and we'll also be able to perform appropriations if necessary and to certify the project as well. Under for early acquisition and must comply with the standard process, we have to have a title report. We have to have an appraisal. We have to have appraisal review. FMVE needs to be established. We then initiate the negotiations. We acquire either through a right of entry or through appropriation to appropriate the parcel, relocation to relocate the tenant or the displacee, and then obtain the control letter of the property needed for the project. Types of forms to notify the owner on the offer. ODOT has the authority to appropriate when we're utilizing the notice of intent to acquire for good faith offer. Its abbreviation is known as the NIAGFO. If ODOT does not have the authority to appropriate, then we are using the notice of intent to acquire good faith offer for early acquisition. This document that you saw is known as the Notice of Intent to Acquire Good Faith Offer for an Early Acquisition. Your top portion of the letter basically is relative to the project information of parcel number, county route and section, the name of the property owner, where they live. When you move to the second area that's highlighted, this gets into the voluntary acquisition language, and it lets you know that ODOT will not use its right of eminent domain. The property owner has the right to refuse ODOT's offer, and then the right to negotiate with ODOT. The next area talks about if there is not an agreement that could be reached between ODOT and the owner, the negotiations is done. In other words, it's terminated. The environmental review process will continue until it's complete. ODOT may present the offer with the authority to appropriate the real property for the transportation project once it becomes fully authorized. Now we're going to take a look at some areas of advanced acquisition. Advanced acquisition comes out of the Real Estate Manual of 5301.11, and also it references out of 23 CFR 710.503, protective buy and hardship acquisition. In general, prior to the environmental approval of a transportation project, the district may request FHWA provide reimbursement for advanced acquisition for protective buy and hardship acquisition purchases under unique circumstances. Under protective buy, we have the regulations that's out of 23 CFR 710.503. It is the acquisition of a particular parcel or a limited number of parcels to prevent imminent development, subdivision assemblage, rezoning, and significant cost increases on a preferred location. The district must clearly demonstrate that the development of such properties would limit transportation choices of an alignment. Under state regulations, ORC 5511.01, State Highway System, allows ODOT an opportunity to purchase right-of-way prior to the imminent development or zoning change. ODOT has to be provided a notice prior to the approval of the development zoning change by local governments. ODOT has 120 days from notice to acquire that property. So what we're saying is as soon as the local governments are aware, they find out, they should be notifying ODOT where we have 120 days to go ahead and try to secure that area of the property that's being acquired. Hardship acquisition. You'll find this regulation out of 23 CFR 710.503. Once again, it is the purchase of the property at the owner's written request to alleviate a particular hardship to the owner. The owner must document that their inability to sell the property is unique in comparison to others along with preferred alignment. Documentation can be on the basis of health, safety, or financial reasons. Hardship requests must be submitted in writing to the district office that will consider such a request. The district is not obligated to concur with that type of request. And now it's time for a knowledge check.